The warm desert air hit Margaret as soon as she stepped out of the airport terminal, the neon glow of Las Vegas shimmering in the distance like a mirage. At 57, she had always preferred quiet escapes, mountain cabins, seaside cottages, anywhere that promised peace. But this trip was different. It wasn't her choice to be here. It was her husband Charles who insisted. Their presence was expected at the wedding of Olivia, the daughter of Margaret's closest friend Diane. A glamorous Las Vegas ceremony was supposed to be a celebration of family, friendship, and love. Margaret clutched her handbag tighter as Charles flagged down a taxi. He had been unusually restless since they landed, pacing, checking his phone, muttering about business emails. She studied him as he spoke to the driver, his tone clipped, his eyes darting around as if he didn't want to be seen. It wasn't the Charles she married 33 years ago, the man who once made her laugh in crowded grocery aisles and held her hand during thunderstorms. Lately, she had grown accustomed to this new version, distracted, irritable, distant. The taxi ride to the Strip was filled with silence, broken only by the humming of slot machines that spilled from hotel entrances. Margaret tried to make small talk about the wedding flowers and the weather forecast, but Charles responded with curt nods, eyes glued to his phone screen. She noticed the way his thumb hovered over the keyboard, then stopped, then deleted a word before typing again. It looked less like work and more like hesitation, as if he was writing something he didn't want her to see. Margaret turned her gaze to the glowing skyline. Las Vegas was everything Diane had ever loved, over the top, sparkling, alive. Diane was the kind of woman who thrived on attention, who wore sequined gowns to dinner parties and spoke with her hands as if she were performing on stage. Margaret, by contrast, preferred soft sweaters, novels, and early evenings by the fireplace. Still, their friendship had survived 4 decades, from college dorms to raising children, from first jobs to gray hairs. Margaret was genuinely happy for Diane, who had saved for years to give her daughter a wedding as dazzling as the city itself. As the taxi pulled into the grand entrance of the Bellagio, Margaret tried to shake off her unease. Perhaps Charles really was just stressed. Perhaps she was overthinking. At 57, she had learned that suspicion could sour even the sweetest moment if she let it. She reminded herself that she came here to celebrate love, not to dig for shadows. Inside the lobby, chandeliers sparkled like frozen waterfalls. Guests in evening wear milled about, laughing, greeting relatives they hadn't seen in years. Margaret smoothed the wrinkles in her blouse, smiling politely at strangers as she followed Charles toward the reception desk. Diane appeared out of nowhere, draped in a golden shawl, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Margaret, you made it!" Diane cried, embracing her tightly. Her perfume, gardenia, strong and sweet, clung to Margaret's shoulder. "Can you believe it? My Olivia getting married in Las Vegas. It feels like a dream." Margaret smiled warmly, hugging her friend back. "It's beautiful, Diane. She must be thrilled." "Oh, she is," Diane said, lowering her voice with a conspiratorial grin. "Though she's nervous, of course." Every bride is behind Diane, Olivia appeared. Tall, graceful, with long auburn hair that caught the light. Margaret had known her since she was a child, had watched her run through sprinklers in Diane's backyard, had attended her high school plays. Now dressed in a simple cream dress for the rehearsal dinner, she looked every bit the poised young woman ready to become a wife. But as Olivia approached, Margaret noticed something odd. The girl's eyes flicked quickly. Not toward Margaret, but toward Charles, who stood slightly apart, pretending to scroll his phone. For a fraction of a second, Olivia's lips curved into a subtle smile, the kind reserved for secrets. Then just as quickly it vanished, replaced by the polite grin of a bride greeting her mother's best friend. Margaret's stomach tightened. It was nothing, she told herself, just nerves. But when Charles finally looked up, their eyes met across the lobby. Not hers and his, but his and Olivia's. And in that brief exchange, Margaret felt a chill crawl across her spine. She said nothing. She tucked the moment into a quiet corner of her mind, the way she might slip a suspicious receipt into a drawer for later. For now, she smiled, accepted Diane's enthusiastic chatter, and let herself be guided toward the glittering elevators. But as the doors slid shut and Charles avoided her gaze once more, Margaret knew something was waiting beneath the surface of this glittering weekend, something that would not stay hidden for long. The rehearsal dinner unfolded in one of the Bellagio's private banquet rooms, its walls draped in ivory fabric and gold trim, chandeliers casting a flattering glow over every guest. Waiters glided between tables with trays of champagne flutes, and laughter rose in waves as friends and relatives toasted to love and good fortune. It was supposed to be a night of joy, the calm before the storm of wedding day chaos. But for Margaret, unease gnawed at her like a secret she couldn't name. She sat beside Diane, who was radiant in a sapphire gown, her laughter filling the room as she told stories of Olivia's childhood. Charles was on Margaret's other side, his shoulders stiff, his attention fixed on his phone rather than the conversation. At first, Margaret tried to ignore it. He had always been a man who prided himself on his business acumen. Perhaps some deal truly did need his attention, even during such a celebration. But when she reached for his hand beneath the table, she felt him flinch, as though her touch had burned him. He recovered quickly, giving her fingers a perfunctory squeeze, before slipping away to refill his glass. Margaret's eyes followed him, and that was when she noticed Olivia. The young woman was across the room, laughing with bridesmaids, but her gaze strayed too often in Charles's direction. It wasn't the glance of a daughter toward a family friend. It lingered, softened, and carried a familiarity that set Margaret's teeth on edge. A memory flashed in Margaret's mind. Nights back home when Charles had returned late, his cologne faintly altered, his explanations vague. He had claimed long hours at the office, yet his suit smelled of perfume not her own. She had chosen silence then, telling herself that age and marriage dulled affection, that perhaps she had grown too suspicious with time. Now sitting beneath the glow of chandeliers, the pieces began to align in patterns she could no longer ignore. When Charles returned to the table, his face was flushed from wine, his smile forced. Margaret noticed the way Olivia glanced at him again, this time with a quick, guilty shift of her eyes. Diane, blissfully unaware, was recounting how Olivia had once insisted on wearing a tiara to kindergarten every day for an entire month. The table erupted in laughter, but Margaret remained silent, her mind elsewhere. Later, as dessert was served, miniature cheesecakes topped with raspberries, Charles excused himself once more. "Work call," he muttered, slipping out into the hallway. Margaret watched him go, her pulse quickening. She rose moments later, murmuring to Diane that she needed some air. Out in the corridor, the sounds of celebration were muffled. Margaret walked slowly, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. Ahead, she caught a glimpse of Charles, leaning against a column, speaking in hushed tones into his phone. His expression was not one of business urgency. It was softer, warmer, almost tender. Then, as though fate had conspired to confirm her fears, Olivia appeared at the far end of the hallway. She hesitated when she saw Charles, then smiled faintly and slipped into a side door nearby. Margaret's breath caught. Charles quickly ended his call and followed, glancing over his shoulder once before disappearing into the same doorway. For a moment, Margaret froze, her mind a battlefield of disbelief and fury. She wanted to storm after them, to fling the door open and demand answers, but her instincts held her back. If she confronted them now without proof, Charles would deny everything, and Olivia might feign innocence. No, Margaret thought, she would not be dismissed as paranoid. She needed evidence, something undeniable. She returned to the banquet room, her face carefully composed. Diane noticed her return and looped an arm through hers, pulling her into a story about wedding dress fittings gone wrong. Margaret forced a smile, nodding where appropriate, but her heart pounded beneath her calm exterior. As the evening wound down, guests exchanged hugs and promises to meet early the next day for the ceremony. Margaret kept her eyes on Olivia, who avoided her gaze altogether. Charles walked beside her, silent and brooding, as though carrying the weight of a secret. Back in their hotel suite, Margaret lay awake long after Charles had fallen into a wine-heavy sleep. The neon lights from the strip bled through the curtains, flickering across the carpet. She stared at the ceiling, her mind replaying the hallway scene again and again. Tomorrow would be the wedding, a day meant to celebrate love and loyalty. But Margaret had seen enough to know betrayal was already seated at the table. She vowed that she would not let it pass unchallenged. And as dawn crept over the desert horizon, Margaret's resolve hardened. She would catch them. She would know the truth. And when she did, the world would hear it. The morning of the wedding dawned bright over the Las Vegas Strip, sunlight bouncing off mirrored towers and gilded signs. Inside the Bellagio, the atmosphere was charged with excitement. Bridesmaids rushing with garment bags, photographers setting up cameras, relatives gathering in the lobby. Yet amid the flurry, Margaret moved with quiet precision, her mind fixed on one purpose: uncovering the truth. Charles had risen early, restless and sharp-tongued when she asked if he wanted breakfast. "Too much to do today," he muttered, slipping his phone into his pocket. His eyes avoided hers, landing instead on the window where the city gleamed below. Margaret watched him from across the room, noticing the way he checked his watch twice in a span of minutes. She dressed carefully, choosing a pale blue blouse and tailored slacks that allowed her to blend in with the wedding crowd without drawing attention. But in her handbag, alongside her lipstick and wallet, she carried something new. Her phone fully charged, camera at the ready. If Charles was hiding something, today she would capture it. Just before noon, Charles made his move. He announced he had to step out for a quick business call, adjusting his tie in the mirror without meeting her eyes. Margaret murmured an absent-minded acknowledgement, careful not to betray the sharp awareness pulsing inside her. As he left the suite, she counted to 30, then slipped out after him. The hotel corridors were buzzing with wedding guests, but Margaret kept her distance, trailing her husband with practiced subtlety. Years of raising children and running a household had honed her ability to observe without being observed. Charles walked briskly, his shoulders squared, his phone pressed to his ear. She followed him through the casino floor, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the jangle of slot machines, until he reached the elevators leading to a quieter wing of the hotel. Margaret hesitated at the corner, heart pounding. He pressed the button and stepped inside. Just as the doors began to close, a familiar figure appeared: Olivia. The young woman hurried forward, her auburn hair cascading over her cream dress. Without a word, she slipped inside the elevator with him. The doors sealed shut, leaving Margaret staring at her own reflection in the brass paneling. Her chest tightened, but she forced herself to think clearly. There would be another chance. She hurried to the next bank of elevators, pressing the button with trembling hands. When the doors opened, she stepped inside, selecting the floor she had seen lit up before Charles disappeared, the 12th. The ride felt endless, her ears filled with the soft hum of machinery and the racing beat of her heart. When the doors opened, she stepped into a quiet hallway lined with suites. For a moment, she thought she had lost them. The corridor was empty, the air heavy with stillness. Then from down the hall, she caught the faint click of a door closing. Margaret walked carefully, her heels muffled against the carpet. Halfway down the corridor, she saw it. Suite 1245. The door had just shut, the "Do Not Disturb" sign swaying faintly from its handle. She stood frozen, rage and sorrow tangling inside her chest. This was no coincidence. This was deliberate. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone. Pressing it against the doorframe, she activated the camera, recording the muffled sounds within. At first there was only silence, then low voices, indistinct but unmistakably familiar. Charles's laugh, warm and intimate. Olivia's voice, soft and teasing. Margaret's stomach lurched as realization cemented into fact. She lifted the phone again, snapping a few quick photos of the door with its room number visible. Proof, she thought, cold and clear. Proof they could not deny. For long minutes she stood there, her breath shallow, fury burning her throat. Every instinct in her screamed to storm inside, to drag them both into the hallway and expose their treachery. But another voice, calm, deliberate, told her to wait. Timing was everything, and what better stage for truth than the very wedding they had come to celebrate. At last, footsteps echoed from the far end of the hall. A hotel maid appeared, pushing a cart of linens. Margaret slipped back toward the elevators before she could be seen. She descended to the lobby, blending once more with the chattering guests gathering for the ceremony. When Charles reappeared an hour later, freshly showered and dressed in his best suit, He carried himself with the smug confidence of a man who believed his secret safe. Olivia arrived soon after, her smile brittle, her eyes avoiding Margaret's. Margaret sat quietly, her phone heavy in her handbag, her lips pressed into a thin line. She now had the evidence she needed. Not suspicion, not guesswork, but truth captured in pixels and sound. And as the bridal procession began to assemble, she vowed that this truth would not remain hidden much longer. The chapel glittered under the spell of Las Vegas extravagance. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in golden light, and towering arrangements of white roses framed the aisle. Guests filled the velvet-lined chairs, their laughter and whispers creating a low hum of anticipation. Margaret sat near the front beside Diane, her best friend, who was radiant in a sequined gown, hands trembling with excitement. Margaret tried to mirror Diane's joy, but her heart thudded in her chest like a warning drum. Her phone rested heavy in her clutch, the photographs and recordings she had captured earlier that day only a swipe away. Every time her gaze wandered to Charles, seated across the aisle in a dark suit, looking every bit the devoted husband, her stomach clenched. He wore a mask so convincing, even Diane would never suspect. But Margaret knew better. Then her eyes found Olivia. The young woman glided into the chapel with her bridesmaids, her auburn hair styled in soft waves, her face glowing beneath careful makeup. To anyone else, she looked like a proud bridesmaid, standing tall at her friend's wedding. But Margaret saw the truth in her trembling hands, the flicker of nervousness that betrayed her polished smile. Their gazes locked for the briefest moment, and Margaret caught it, that flash of guilt, that silent plea not to be unmasked. The ceremony began. The bride, radiant in lace and satin, walked down the aisle on her father's arm. Applause and sniffles filled the room, and Diane pressed a handkerchief to her eyes, whispering, "Isn't she beautiful?" Margaret nodded, her throat tight. She wanted to be swept away by the moment, to share in her friend's happiness, but betrayal buzzed in her ears like static. She kept glancing toward Charles, who leaned forward, pretending to be enthralled by the vows. His gaze, however, strayed, just once, toward Olivia, and Margaret caught it. A stolen glance too quick for most, but damning to the woman who had been watching him closely for weeks. Margaret's fingers tightened around her clutch. She could end it now. She could stand up and demand attention, revealing the proof she had gathered only hours before. A part of her burned to do it, to watch Charles's mask crack, to see Olivia stripped of her pretense in front of her mother, her friends, the entire wedding party. The justice of it almost tasted sweet on her tongue. But then she looked at Diane, her lifelong friend, dabbing at tears, her face glowing with maternal pride. Margaret's resolve faltered. To shatter this moment would be to shatter Diane's joy, to turn a wedding into a scandal that would live forever in whispers and headlines. Margaret felt trapped between two agonies, silence that suffocated her, or truth that would devastate everyone. The officiant's voice rose, declaring vows and promises of eternal love. Margaret heard the words but felt none of their beauty. Her mind replayed the muffled laughter behind Suite 1245's door, the subtle touches between Charles and Olivia at the rehearsal dinner, the flinch in his hand when she tried to hold it. Each memory sharpened into a blade pressing against her heart. As the bride and groom exchanged rings, Margaret closed her eyes, taking in a slow breath. She would wait. Not here, not now. The reception would be better, when the lights dimmed, when wine loosened tongues, when no fragile vows hung in the air like glass about to shatter. She would choose her moment carefully, and when it came, there would be no mistaking her words for bitterness or paranoia. When the officiant finally declared, "You may kiss the bride," the chapel erupted in applause. Margaret clapped too, her smile polite, though her insides churned. She watched the bride and groom embrace, the beginning of their story unfolding under the glow of chandeliers. Around her, guests rose, cheering and wiping away tears. Only Margaret remained anchored in stillness, her resolve hardening beneath the applause. As the newlyweds walked back down the aisle, hands entwined, Margaret stole one last glance at Charles. His smile was broad, his act flawless. But Margaret knew what was buried beneath it. And tonight, when glasses clinked and music swelled, she would be the one to rip away the mask. For now she stood and followed the stream of guests toward the reception hall, her phone clutched tightly against her side. The truth had waited this long. It could wait a little longer. The reception hall glowed with 1,000 tiny lights strung across the ceiling, like a blanket of stars. Round tables draped in ivory cloth filled the room, each adorned with vases of fresh orchids and flickering candles. A jazz band played softly in the corner, setting a mood of elegance that was equal parts celebratory and intoxicating. Guests mingled with champagne glasses in hand, laughter rising above the clinking of silverware. Margaret entered with Diane at her side, her smile fixed though her chest ached with unease. Across the room, Charles was already at the bar, gesturing animatedly to a group of cousins, his drink filled higher than usual. Olivia slipped past soon after, her bridesmaid dress hugging her figure, her expression strained behind a mask of politeness. Margaret's eyes tracked them both, her every instinct sharpened, waiting for a misstep. The evening began with speeches. The bride's father toasted his daughter and new son-in-law with heartfelt words that brought the room to tears. Diane followed, her voice trembling with pride as she told stories of Olivia's childhood friendship with the bride. Sleepovers, dance recitals, years of laughter. Margaret clapped with everyone else, though her stomach twisted. Diane's words, so innocent, now carried a cruel irony. Her daughter's loyalty had been twisted into betrayal, and Diane didn't even know. Margaret glanced at Olivia during the applause. The young woman's face was pale, her smile brittle. She fiddled with her champagne flute, her eyes darting toward Charles, who raised his glass in a quiet, secretive nod. The gesture was small, but Margaret saw it. She always saw. When the dinner began, Margaret found herself seated 2 chairs away from Charles. He leaned back in his seat, laughing too loudly at jokes, his cheeks flushed with drink. The scent of whiskey clung to him, and his eyes gleamed with the careless boldness of a man who thought himself untouchable. Margaret resisted the urge to call him out right there. Not yet, she told herself. Timing was everything. Between courses, she excused herself to the powder room. Once inside, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through the evidence she had captured. The photograph of Suite 1245, the faint but incriminating recording of voices. Proof. Her hand trembled, but her resolve hardened. She would not be dismissed as a paranoid wife. Tonight, she would make the world see the truth. When she returned, she slid into her seat with a calm smile, masking the storm within. Charles was deep in conversation with a groomsman, his laughter spilling over. Olivia, across the room, picked at her food, barely touching her plate. The guilt hung on her like a shadow. As the band transitioned to livelier tunes, guests filled the dance floor. Diane tugged Margaret up to join them, her joy infectious, her eyes shining with pride. For a moment, Margaret let herself sway with her friend, their laughter mingling with the music. But as she spun, she caught sight of Charles again, leaning too close toward Olivia near the bar, their shoulders brushing in a way that was far from accidental. Margaret's blood ran cold. She excused herself from Diane and stepped off the dance floor, her gaze locked on the pair. Charles whispered something in Olivia's ear, and the girl's forced smile faltered. Margaret saw it clearly. Fear, guilt, and the flicker of shame. It was the final straw. Margaret crossed the room and paused near the DJ's stand, her hand brushing the microphone. She could feel her pulse hammering in her throat, her heart torn between fury and sorrow. She wasn't ready to speak yet, but soon, very soon, she would. Instead, she turned to her nephew Michael, who had grown up around both families and was someone she trusted deeply. "I need you to see something," she whispered, slipping her phone from her clutch. She showed him the recording and the photos, her voice trembling but steady. Michael's jaw tightened as he scrolled. "My God, Aunt Margaret, this is serious. What are you going to do?" Margaret's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I'm going to tell the truth." Tonight, Michael hesitated, then nodded firmly. "I'll stand by you." Margaret slipped the phone back into her clutch, her mind racing. The wedding had been beautiful, the bride radiant, the vows moving, but beneath the glittering surface lay rot, and Margaret would no longer allow it to fester unseen. Though I yiddy night wore on, music swelling, glasses clinking, laughter echoing across the hall. But for Margaret, the air grew heavier, her chest tighter. She felt the moment drawing closer, as inevitable as the desert sunrise. And when it came, she promised herself, it would strike like lightning. The reception had reached its peak. The dance floor pulsed with laughter and music, glasses clinked in celebration, and the bride and groom basked in the glow of their new beginning. Diane, radiant with pride, was flitting from table to table, her joy boundless. To any outsider, the evening was perfect. But for Margaret, each beat of the music hammered against her chest like a countdown. She sat poised at her table, her clutch resting in her lap. Inside, her phone waited, carrying the truth like a loaded weapon. She felt Michael's steady gaze from across the room. He gave her a subtle nod, his expression firm. She wasn't alone in this. Charles stood at the bar, glass in hand, his laugh booming as he charmed a circle of cousins. Olivia hovered nearby, pale and jittery, her bridesmaid dress shimmering under the lights. She avoided Margaret's gaze, sipping nervously at her drink. The more Margaret watched them, the more her fury hardened into resolve. The time had come. When the DJ announced it was time for toasts, the room settled into a hush. The best man spoke first, followed by the maid of honor. Sentimental words filled the air, punctuated by cheers and tears. Then the DJ called for any other words from loved ones. It was the moment Margaret had been waiting for. She rose slowly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. Heads turned toward her, smiles spreading across familiar faces. Diane beamed, expecting a heartfelt tribute from her best friend. Margaret held the microphone with both hands, steadying her breath. At weddings, she began, her voice clear but trembling, we celebrate love, loyalty, and family. We speak of trust and devotion, the very pillars of marriage. She paused, her eyes sweeping the crowd. But sometimes those pillars crumble. Sometimes betrayal hides beneath smiles and bows. A ripple of unease moved through the room. Charles shifted in his seat, his face stiffening. Olivia's hands clenched around her glass, her knuckles white. Margaret drew in a breath and lifted her clutch. I came here tonight to honor my best friend Diane and her daughter. But I cannot sit here in silence while lies poison this celebration. She unlocked her phone, projecting her voice so no one could miss a word. My husband Charles has been having an affair. Not with a stranger, not with someone far removed, but with Olivia, the daughter of my dearest friend. Gasps erupted across the hall. Diane froze in place, her mouth opening soundlessly, the color draining from her face. The bride let out a startled cry, her new husband clutching her hand in shock. Charles shot to his feet, his voice sharp. Margaret, that's enough. This is madness. But Margaret held up her phone, her fingers swift. She played the muffled recording. Charles's laugh, Olivia's voice, intimate and unmistakable. The sounds echoed through the speakers, silencing the room. Then she flashed the photos on the screen, the suite door with its number visible, the timestamp undeniable. The crowd erupted in a chorus of disbelief and outrage. Guests whispered fiercely, some covering their mouths, others shaking their heads in disgust. Diane staggered back, her hand clutching her chest, eyes brimming with tears as she turned to her daughter. Olivia, tell me it's not true. Olivia's lips quivered, tears spilling down her cheeks. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her silence was louder than any confession. Charles lunged toward Margaret, his face contorted with rage. You vindictive! Enough! Margaret's voice cut through like a blade. She stood taller, her grief hardened into steel. You betrayed me, Charles. You betrayed our marriage, our family, and the trust of everyone here. And you, Olivia. She turned, her gaze piercing the trembling young woman. You destroyed your own mother's faith on the very night we were meant to honor her. The room descended into chaos. Diane collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably, while relatives rushed to her side. The bride's makeup streaked with tears as she screamed at her cousin, shoving her away from the table. Olivia crumpled under the weight of it, shaking her head, whispering, I'm sorry, though no one seemed to hear. Security moved in as voices rose, some guests demanding Charles and Olivia leave. Michael stepped forward, placing a protective hand on Margaret's shoulder, his glare pinning Charles in place. For the first time that evening, Charles faltered. His bravado crumbled, his face pale, his words tangled. It wasn't supposed to, but the evidence needed no explanation. The truth hung in the air, undeniable, irreversible. Margaret handed back the microphone, her voice steady as she said, "This wedding deserves honesty. Now everyone knows the truth." As she walked away from the center of the room, the music had stopped, the laughter silenced, and all that remained was the echo of betrayal. The reception never recovered. The glittering hall, once filled with laughter and music, now simmered with anger, shame, and disbelief. Guests whispered in hushed tones, eyes darting toward Charles and Olivia, who sat apart, isolated, as though the very air around them carried poison. Diane had been escorted out of the room by her sisters, her sobs echoing down the corridor. Her daughter's betrayal had cut deeper than any wound, leaving her trembling and broken. The bride had locked herself in the bridal suite, refusing to return to her own reception, her perfect day shattered in less than a heartbeat. Margaret, though her hands still shook from the confrontation, held her head high. She hadn't come to Las Vegas to burn a wedding to the ground, but silence had never been an option. Betrayal, left unchecked, festers like rot, and now at least the infection had been dragged into the light. Charles stumbled after her once the chaos subsided, his tie askew, his face blotched with drink and humiliation. "Margaret," he hissed, his voice thick with anger. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "You've ruined everything." Margaret turned to face him, her eyes cold, her voice steady. "No, Charles, you ruined everything. I only revealed the truth you worked so hard to bury. You could have kept quiet." His voice rose, attracting stares. "We could have handled this privately." Her laugh was bitter, sharp. "Privately? Like the way you crept into hotel rooms with her behind my back? Like the way you smiled at me while holding her hand in secret? No, Charles. The world needed to see what you are. And now they do," he faltered, his words collapsing under the weight of her calm fury. When Olivia approached, her mascara streaked and her shoulders trembling, Charles reached for her arm as though seeking an ally. But Olivia wrenched away, shaking her head violently. "Don't touch me," she whispered, shame painting her cheeks scarlet. "This was a mistake. All of it." Margaret felt no sympathy. Olivia had chosen her path, and now she bore its consequences. Diane's daughter had destroyed her mother's trust, humiliated herself, and shattered bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. No apology would ever mend that. Within an hour, the newlyweds departed in tears, escorted quietly by family who refused to let the day spiral further. Diane, still devastated, refused to look at her daughter. She clung instead to Margaret's hand when they crossed paths in the hotel corridor. "I don't know how to face her," Diane sobbed. Margaret squeezed her gently. "You don't have to tonight. Let the truth settle. You'll decide in your own time. But remember, this betrayal is theirs, not yours." By dawn, word had spread through every guest, every relative. Charles and Olivia had become pariahs, their names whispered with disgust. Charles, once admired for his charm and business acumen, now found only doors closed in his face. Olivia, stripped of her mother's protection, left the city in shame, her future uncertain. Margaret, however, found herself surrounded by quiet support. Michael checked on her constantly, and Diane, though wounded, leaned on her old friend as if Margaret were the only solid ground left. For the first time in months, Margaret felt strong. Not broken, not humiliated, but vindicated. Back home, she filed for divorce. The evidence she had collected, coupled with Charles's very public exposure, left no room for disputes. Lawyers worked swiftly, ensuring she received what was rightfully hers. Charles tried to fight, at first with bluster and denial, later with desperate pleas, but Margaret's resolve never wavered. On the day the papers were finalized, she stood outside the courthouse, the Nevada sun casting long shadows across the pavement. She felt lighter than she had in years, as though a burden had been lifted from her chest. For decades, she had been Charles's wife, patient, loyal, forgiving. Now she was simply Margaret again, a woman free to live on her own terms. She thought of Diane, still struggling to reconcile with Olivia and the bride, whose wedding day had ended in disaster. Pain lingered, yes, but truth had a way of cleansing even the deepest wounds. Margaret hoped that in time, they too would find their strength. That night, Margaret sat on her porch with a glass of wine, watching the sky darken into velvet. The betrayal still hurt. It always would. But it no longer defined her. She had faced deception head-on, ripped away the mask, and walked out whole. Justice hadn't come quietly, nor without cost. But it had come. And for Margaret, that was enough.